All right, thanks. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be back here at Vail for the second year. I think it was Monday or Tuesday, we released the 2016 Energy Outlook. As you know, that's our long-range forecast that we update every year within ExxonMobil. Develop it with our team of scientists, engineers, economists. It's a grassroots forecast, so we look in great detail. We look at 100 countries, look at something like 15 sectors of the global economy. And the goal of the outlook for us is not to paint the future or paint a picture the way we would like it to be, but to achieve and develop a balanced, sort of a 50% case, realistic view of what we think the energy outlook is. And we do this. This is our primary planning document that we use to plan our business, and so we have great incentives to get this right. So let's see, hold on, let me make sure, there we go. So I'm going to talk about 6 key themes today. First one, energy is fundamental to standards of living. Secondly, energy demand, by and large, out through 2040 is going to be driven by developing nations, China and India in particular, but other developing nations. Economics, policies in particular, greenhouse gas policies, most notably, will shape the energy mix. Oil should remain the primary fuel out through 2040. It's used primarily in transportation. But demand for natural gas we expect to grow probably more than any other energy source. And lastly, technology has the highest potential for advancing energy and environmental goals. It also introduces a great deal of uncertainty. I'm going to give you 3 numbers before I start with the main portion of the presentation. And remember these, you'll see them kind of develop through the presentation. First, out through 2040, the global economy is expected to double. It'll be twice the size of what it was in 2014. Whoops, I'm sorry. However, we're only going to need about 25% more energy, and that's by and large because of advances in efficiency. And lastly, CO2 emissions per unit of GDP. We expect CO2 emissions to peak about 2030. CO2 emissions per unit of GDP should be cut in half. So those are the 3 numbers. Take a look at this. I thought, given the focus of this audience in North America, you can see this in energy trends in the U.S. You see GDP doesn't quite double, it goes up about 90% over this period. Demand actually decreases slightly, so demand's fairly flat, and sort of the difference between GDP growth and demand growth you can think of as efficiency gains. And carbon emissions actually drop in the United States, and that's because of changes in the mix, and I'll talk about this in subsequent slides. So next, let me just talk about the fundamental of energy for standards of living. Having a little trouble with there we go. So this is just a plot of the UN Human Development Index. That's an index that charts on the y-axis, looks at life expectancy, education, living standards. Countries like Norway and the US, pretty high up on that index, also high on energy use, and countries sort of the inverse. You look at countries like the Congo, Bangladesh, kind of low on the Human Development Index and also relatively low on energy use. While the circumstances kind of vary across all the different countries that are plotted here and the countries of the world, the trend is quite clear. Human development requires energy. And it's pretty easy to understand that when you think about sort of the modern appliances that we enjoy in this country, things like washing machines, refrigerators, clean water, air conditioners, cell phones, computers, modern medicine. All those things require energy, and they also add to human development. So developing nations lead in GDP growth and living standards improvement. The biggest driver of energy demand through 2040 will be gains in GDP and living standards for the developing countries. And that's a good news story if you're in one of these developing countries. This is a look at GDP as it stands in 2014. You can see the OECD dominates global GDP. Total GDP is about $72 trillion. About 63% of that comes from the OECD. Another about 11% from China, 3% from India, another about 10 or 11% from what we call key growth countries. And I'll name those. You'll see those colored in purple throughout the presentation. Those are Brazil, Mexico, Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Thailand, Indonesia. And of course, if you're listening closely, Mexico and Turkey are part of the OECD. We've pulled them out of the OECD because they have these characteristics along with the other 8 that we've listed in those key growths. And they have strong gains in population, they have strong gains in GDP, and therefore they're sort of as a block, they're important to think about for energy demand evolution. So if we fast forward to 2040, you'll see the GDP just about doubles. It's about 150 trillion in 2010 dollars. And because the developing world economies grow at a rate and pace faster than the OECD, all economies grow, the OECD grows as well, but because the developing world economies grow at a rate and pace faster than the OECD, you see that by 2040, a little bit more than half of global GDP comes from the developing world. Of course, China grows. We think they'll grow at about 5%. They slow through the period, so they're a little over 5% out through about 2025. They slow to just below 5% in the second half of that period. And that's a result of demographics. So if you look at the demographics of China, their working age population tends to shrink. Their over 65 population grows. And that's, to a certain extent, a result of the one-child policy kind of working its way through their demographics. They also start to transition from sort of an industry-heavy, infrastructure-heavy economy to a more of a service and sort of less energy-intensive economy. You see India grows a little bit faster than China, and these 10 key growth countries as well grow. However, even with this growth, by 2040, income levels, so if you look at income levels, GDP per capita in the developing countries, they're still about 65% lower than the OECD. So even with the progress, you still have billions of people that remain far below living standards we enjoy, and of course, they'll continue to strive to move up that standard of living. So if we look at now at energy demand, so GDP doubles, so grows 100%. Energy demand globally, we think, grows by about 25%. And we've broken it down by region. You see OECD actually is flat. It's actually slightly down by about 0.2% per year through this period. China grows about a little over 1%. India about slightly less than 2.5%, and key growth just slightly less than 2%. So all the increase in energy demand comes from the developing world. The flat demand in developing countries, it's actually quite an accomplishment. So those economies continue to expand, but they expand without requiring more energy. And that's a great story, and it's a story of energy efficiency. So it's figuring out how to do more with less. And we think energy efficiency gains will be across all sectors, so vehicles, buildings, industry, all sectors of the economy. It also reflects the fact that energy use is pretty widespread in the OECD, and that, to a certain extent, limits growth in energy demand as well. So you think about it, how many cars can you have? How many homes can you have? How many refrigerators do you need if you're in one of these developed countries in the OECD? However, energy penetration of energy-using appliances is a lot less in the developing world. For example, if you look at India, you have about 2 cars for every 100 people, where in the OECD or North America, you have about 60 cars per person. So one of the key drivers, when I look at this to me is sort of the key driver of energy growth in the developing world. This is growth in the middle class. So these are the people that are going from a situation where they're probably worrying about whether they can put food on the table or they can heat their home, keep their family comfortable and fed. They're getting to the point where they can actually step up and start buying some of these things that we take for granted. So they're starting to buy their first refrigerator, they're starting to buy their first TV, perhaps buy their first apartment and then furnish that, and then eventually buy their first car. And you see the global middle class through 2040 grows by about 3 billion people. Those 3 billion middle class consumers, just slightly under 1 billion in China, just slightly over 1 billion in India, and about another billion across the rest of the developing world. And you see the OECD middle class stays about the same. Economics and policies will impact the fuel mix. So in a nutshell, I've kind of talked about the demand picture. GDP up 100%, energy demand up 25%. But what types of fuels go into the mix, by and large, are going to be influenced by relative economics, and economics will be highly influenced by technology. I'll show you that in a few slides on, but also influenced by policies. And the policy that's probably having the most influence is policies to limit greenhouse gas or CO2 emissions. I'd like to start this with a couple of quotes. This is one from Ban Ki-moon in the UN. Talks about the importance of energy for development. Just important, you can note a couple things. About 1.2 billion people don't have electricity. So we take electricity for granted. We plug in our iPhone when we want to charge it, turn on the lights, and there's electricity there. About 1.2 billion people don't have access to modern electricity, and somewhere over 2.5 billion across the world still cook with sort of primitive forms of energy like wood, biomass, dung. So energy is important to move people up the development ladder. Another quote here. This one actually comes from Rex Tillerson, our CEO. Talks about the importance of addressing the risks of climate change. And of course, COP21 just completed in Paris back in December, and that pretty much validated our expectation that we built into the energy outlook, which is we think just about every nation is going to take steps to address greenhouse gas emissions. They'll do that in their own way. They'll do that at their own rate and pace. That is the construct of the agreement. But we do expect over time that greenhouse gas policies to address greenhouse gases, whether those are standards, whether those are renewable portfolio standards, incentives, whether they're cap and trade system, taxes, the whole suite of policies to address greenhouse gases will continue to get more stringent over time. We've built this into our energy outlook pretty much over the last decade, and we use a proxy cost of carbon that increases over time to try and reflect that when we do our modeling of the energy system. So what that drives is it drives a shift in the mix to lower carbon intensity fuels. Excuse me. And you see here 2014 and 2040 plot of the percentage of the energy mix by different types of fuels. And you see, in particularly coal loses share. Coal loses about 6% share in gas, nuclear, in renewables, particularly solar and wind in the renewable space, gain share, and they each gain about 3 percentage points on the global energy mix. There we go. Efficiency is important. It tends to flatten this curve. This actually shows energy-related CO2 emissions by region, and you'll note the OECD is down almost 25% over this period. So OECD emissions actually peaked about 2008. After the global recession, they've never quite gone back up to the levels they were, and they continue on a slow downward trend. We think China's emissions will peak somewhere between 2025 and 2030. It's almost exactly what they committed in their INDC and their NDC now. And we think overall global emissions across the world will peak by about 2030. Our view here is it's pretty similar to other credible forecasters such as the IEA, although the IEA actually has emissions going up through 2040, and we're just a little bit more aggressive on our policy assumptions, and that tends to turn this curve over a little more quickly, a little earlier than what the IEA might think. So I thought it might be instructive to look at how you get there is kind of important. So I put this slide in here. This looks at the power sector in the US, and the power sector around the world is the biggest generator of CO2 emissions. And this shows the US between 2005 and 2012, and we have good data up through 2012. And you can see in the US the dramatic increase in the use of natural gas, primarily driven by economics, relative economics to incent fuel switching, and also by policy. So policy that sort of weighs on the coal industry. And you see this dramatic increase in natural gas use in the power sector. Nuclear stayed about the same, and you also see a pretty good increase in wind and solar. I thought it'd be interesting to contrast. Here's Germany. Germany took a little bit different pathway, and they went very, very heavy in wind and solar, and actually put in place policies to phase out nuclear. So you see there's a big difference. Haven't done much with gas, haven't done too much with coal, but you see that renewables really has taken up the share. It's interesting to note that the United States over this period of time actually decreased CO2 intensity by about 16%, while Germany did about a 4% decrease. So both areas decreased, but the US about 4 times as much as Germany. The other thing to note that we didn't put on the slide here is German electricity prices are 2 to 3 times higher than they are here in the US. So it really matters how you do this, and particularly if you're a consumer. So you need to be thoughtful about policies, thoughtful about implementation here. So oil remains the world's primary fuel through 2040. And here we're very consistent as well with the IEA. And of course, most liquids go into 2 sectors, one sector being transportation. That's the biggest sector. 95% of the world's transport today are met by liquid fuels like gasoline, diesel, jet fuel. They're widely available, easy to transport, pack a lot of energy in a small volume, so very energy dense and quite affordable, particularly now. The other big source of liquids demand is industrial demand, particularly into the petrochem sector. So when you think about the underlying drivers of growth in GDP as well as efficiency, so those two tend to drive chemical demand quite significantly. So all the products that are made, that are shipped, and they're made to be more efficient, like lightweighting of vehicles, for example, lightweighting of packaging, downgauging of packaging, all of those tend to drive chemical demand. So these underlying drivers of GDP and efficiency tend to drive that chemical demand as well. And that increase in chemical demand accounts for most of the industrial sector. And take a look here just at transport, since it's the biggest sector. Overall transport demand for liquids grows about 15 million barrels a day. And when I think about transport, I think about 2 things. I think about the developing world, primarily Asia, but not just Asia. And I think about commercial transport. So the 12 countries, so China, India, those 10 key growth countries that I talked about, they make up about 80% of the global growth in transport demand. You look at light duty, so here's the split by application. So light duty on the bottom, think of that as cars and light duty trucks. And then commercial, so that whole suite of heavy duty, aviation, marine, rail transport. So we think about that as commercial. Light duty, actually, demand for fuels actually peaks before about 2020. And simplistic, said simplistically, miles driven about double, and efficiency about doubles, and that kind of keeps this flat to slightly down. And I'll show you a slide on how the mix changes on the next slide. So all the increase in transport demand comes from this commercial space, and particularly heavy-duty demand. So that's demand to truck goods and services around. And all those sectors basically are driven by increases in GDP. So as global GDP grows, so grows commercial activity. And despite fairly significant increases in efficiency across all of these sectors, so we would expect aviation to get more efficient, so think 787s versus the existing fleet. So carbon fiber and very highly efficient engines drive efficiency in the aviation sector. You see developments in the marine sector. You see developments in the trucking sector as well. All those sectors have pretty significant efficiency gains, but they're not enough to offset this dramatic increase in commercial activity as driven by global GDP. So light-duty vehicles, this one's interesting. I know I was on a panel with the folks from Tesla, so this is always sort of an interesting, very quickly evolving sector. This is what we think the global annual sales by type in the light-duty sector are going to be. And we expect policy to continue to push efficiency improvements. So CAFE, tailpipe emission standards in the EU countries, and efficiency as well in all the other major economies, so China, India, et cetera. And we see, at least out through 2025, improvements in traditional internal combustion engines, drivetrains, body types, so lightweighting of body types, actually the primary means to meet increasing efficiency standards. When you get out beyond 2025, hybrid technology continues to improve and come down the cost curve, and so hybrids become a very competitive option to help companies meet ever-increasingly stringent tailpipe or CAFE standards, fuel economy standards. You also see significant growth here in electric vehicles, so if you're my Tesla friends, fear not. Electric vehicles grow by almost 300% over this period of time. And they actually account, we think, in the new car vehicle sales for about 7% of the mix by 2040. And of course, if you roll this on forward, these costs continue to come down and they'll continue to gain share in the mix out past this period. This just kind of shows you the history of what people have been buying. Of course, you see since 2010 when sort of the new CAFE standards, you know, think Ford EcoBoost, think F-150 lightweighting, think other sort of downsizing, turbo boosting, drivetrain, 8-speed transmission type. And you see that the boosted, those types of sort of traditional fuel economy measures, sort of traditional type technologies with traditional internal combustion engine have taken the vast majority of the share for new car sales. Talk a little bit about natural gas. Natural gas grows more than any other source of energy through this period. About 40% of the total increase in natural gas is, or in global energy is met by natural gas. It's reliable, versatile, and has a relatively low carbon content. So if you fuel switch to natural gas, you're probably 50 to 60% less than the emissions, CO2 emissions from a traditional coal-fired power plant. We actually think natural gas will surpass coal over this period as the second largest energy source. So it grows in all sectors, but grows the most in power generation. Global demand grows about 50%, grows about 64% in the power generation sector. And industrial grows as well. Of course, natural gas gets used a lot in places like petrochems and other basic materials manufacturing. So just take a look here at where it grows. It grows in industrial, as I mentioned, grows in residential and commercial. Doesn't grow too much in transport. A lot was kind of, when you had a big spread between gas and oil, so you had, you know, maybe oil at $180 or $100 a barrel and gas at $2 a million BTU, you have a big economic drive to try and move natural gas into transport, but you don't see too much of that. You do see the growth mostly in electricity. So just to contrast kind of the growth here, you do see some growth in the US and in Europe, OECD countries, dramatically different when you look at these key growth countries. So China, of course, surpassed somewhere around 2005 or 6, surpassed the United States as the highest electricity consumer. The key growth countries probably do that as a group by 2040, and of course India approaches the Europe OECD. So only about 10% of the total growth here comes out of the OECD. If you look at fuels for electricity, you see, of course, starting with gas and working your way up, those are lower carbon content. We think they grow faster than the average. You look at coal use kind of flattens out, and coal use in the OECD really gets driven out of the mix as you get more and more stringent policies. Wind and solar here reach a combined share of about 10%. I'll show you a little bit more in a few charts on that. So they grow pretty rapidly and get to about 10%, and it varies across regions, as I'll show you. So last but not least, talk a little bit about technology. It has a lot of potential. This is just a chart of energy intensity per unit of GDP, and of course you see it's been falling through the period. It continues, we think it continues to fall through the period, and actually the line doesn't look like it actually accelerates a little bit through this period. You can't see it on this chart so well. So you think about movement from, say, incandescent lights to LEDs, regular sort of cars back in the 70s when I started driving, to hybrids and electric vehicles. You can see the impact of technology on sort of energy intensity and the ability to do more with less all across the economy, not in every sector and every part of the economy. So a couple areas where we've seen really pretty dramatic technology advancement. One is in wind and solar. Of course, you've seen wind turbines get bigger. You've seen them get more efficient at harvesting wind energy. Of course, you've seen solar panel prices drop dramatically and increased deployment of both of those technologies. We think those will continue. We think they may flatten a bit. That has a lot to do with subsidies and how subsidy and sort of regulatory regimes to encourage adoption of those. In general, we think those may ratchet back a bit, but we do think these will continue to grow dramatically. And wind and solar go from about 4 to 11% of total power delivered over this time period between 2014 and 2040. We think wind is going to grow predominantly from onshore. Offshore wind ends up being significantly more difficult and more expensive. Not that there won't be some growth there, but we think it's sort of the economics will favor onshore wind. And then lastly, I guess for the EU, here I'll just show you a chart here. This kind of shows you the electricity share delivered by that, most prominent in the EU, where it gets up to about 25%. A little bit less in the US and China and India as well. So you can just kind of see the differences between the penetration rates across the different areas. Here's one. I sat in on the panel this morning that was talking about technology development in the oil and gas industry. And I want to say the word was spectacular, I think was used. Nothing short of amazing was used. And I would tend to agree. This is crude and condensate production. And that uptick is all the result of technology. So that's unconventional technology. That's 3D seismic, directional drilling, multi-stage completion, hydrofracturing technologies, and then a whole suite of improvements in the efficiency across those. And you'll hear more about that. And there's a panel this afternoon. I encourage you to listen to it. But this is nothing short of amazing. You see it in dry gas production as well. And we've just seen this dramatic increase in production over the last decade. This increase in production impacts North America's supply-demand, so I thought I'd just show you North American supply-demand. Of course, back in 2010, North America, significant importer. By 2020, we think North America will be sort of balanced to net export post-2020. And you see tight oil, so the light green natural gas liquids, which really come off of that natural gas production, and oil sands and deep water. So a lot of this increase in production that you see that's enabling North America to go from net import to net export is all a result of technology. You see it in natural gas as well. Of course, unconventional in North America dominates the natural gas production, and as shown by that light pink wedge. And of course, probably before 2020, we can have enough natural gas to be net exporters as well. Having sort of grown up in the 70s and started in this industry in 1980, I never thought I would be saying that North America would be a net exporter of both liquids and gas. It's nothing short of amazing, and it's all the result of technology and innovation. So last slide I have here. This just kind of sums up the changes in demand. So average demand grows 25%. That's about 0.9% per year, significantly below global GDP growth. You see oil remains the major source or the largest source of energy. Natural gas surpasses coal. Coal actually increases and then starts to decrease. First time in history that's ever happened. So it kind of stays flat to about down. And then on the right-hand side, you see nuclear, solar, wind, biofuels, hydro, and geothermal. So all those lower CO2, sort of non-CO2 producing sources of energy grow significantly. Nuclear, we think, I didn't mention it earlier, but nuclear grows in China in the near term and then in the OECD, perhaps later in the period in the US as well as South Korea. So that's, of course, dictated by policy and public acceptance, and so a little bit of uncertainty there, but we certainly think the economics and the fundamental drive for lower greenhouse gas emissions would support that type of rate and pace of growth. So with that, I do encourage you, if you're interested in this, this is online. It is updated and is brand new this past week, so you can go and download it. And if I have time, I'll take a question or two, and if your question isn't answered, I'll be around through Sunday and happy to chat offline as well. Ooh, I have a lot of them. How much time do I have? Any idea? I don't know.
3 or 4 minutes, 5 minutes.
Okay.
First or two.
Yeah, so here's a question, of course, right in the space that I work. Some believe we can go to 100% renewables by 2050, at least for electricity. What would the world look like, foreseen and unforeseen consequences? So the big challenge with, well, a couple challenges. One, the big holy grail is storage. So renewables, by and large, with the exception of, say, hydro, geothermal are kind of location limited. You can time shift and with those, but the big grail, holy grail for renewables, intermittent renewables, wind and solar, is storage. A lot of work being done on storage by folks at Stanford and GCEP that I'm associated with. So some great work being done there, but finding affordable, deployable storage so you can time shift, and in particular that's cheap is sort of the holy grail there. Big concern, of course, and cost ends up being a concern. So you need to continue to come down the cost curve, and you need to address intermittency. And to a certain extent, you've got a location shift as well. So lots of wind resource in the mid-continent, lots of demand on the East Coast, and so you need to have transmission to be able to also location balance. Of course, economics and cost ends up being an issue. You know, if you have unlimited funds, you can kind of do anything. The world doesn't have unlimited money to spend to address all the issues. There's 17 sustainable development goals. Greenhouse gases are one of those 17, so there are lots of other important items that need to be taken care of, and so you need to be efficient about how you spend your money. Yeah, I showed you the impact of how you do this makes a difference, and German electricity rates would sort of support that. Coal, oil, gas remain very large. Is that true? What technology options matter most for emission reductions? Of course, efficiency is probably the biggest. So for emissions reductions, efficiency gains that we've programmed in, we're pretty aggressive on efficiency. So the efficiency gains versus sort of a constant GDP or unit of energy per unit of GDP are about the same as total energy demand in 2010. Said another way, if you looked at the area under the curve, so efficiency, so what was saved, it's like 10 times global energy demand now. So that area under the curve from efficiency ends up being hugely important. So that's probably the most important. Of course, technology developments in all sectors. Natural gas is important. Continued gains in natural gas. Renewables, the one technology, I'll be on a panel tomorrow. We think the economics are favorable for this. The policy space needs a little work, but carbon capture and sequestration ends up being a really important technology to afford to decarbonize the global energy system. We think carbon capture and sequestration ends up being affordable at about $80 to $100 a ton CO2. Contrast that with, say, rooftop solar, which is in the $300 or $400 a ton right now. So that's an important technology development as well. All these technologies are important, so there's no single silver bullet. Our view is all these technology developments are important. Efficiency is hugely important, but all these low carbon technologies, including nuclear technology as well. So advancements in nuclear to make it inherently more safe and more acceptable publicly are also important. So all those things need to be worked on. Nuclear share, which regions of the world? Okay, so I kind of mentioned this. In 2040, you show an increase in nuclear share of global energy. China, for sure, is the most important one that's building nuclear plants right now. Later in the period, we think that we would hope for improvements in technology, as I mentioned, to make nuclear inherently more acceptable, but also perhaps less chunky from an investment standpoint. So when I say that a nuclear plant's maybe 5 to 10 billion, takes you 10 years to build and you don't get any cash flow out of it until you've started it up. Huge risk profile, and so improvements in nuclear. And I'm going to take one more real quickly. Total Germany when it comes to CO2 emissions. Compared growth rates of CO2 in the U.S., how does the U.S. compare in total to Germany when it comes to CO2 emissions? Sorry, I don't remember offhand. U.S. is big, second biggest in CO2 emissions behind China right now. So important that Germany's, can't remember if they're in the top 5 or not, but our growth, we've actually reduced CO2 emissions more than any other nation in the world over the last couple of years, a lot of that because of fuel switching. So with that, I'm out of time. Thank you for your attention. It's a pleasure.